Hi, everybody. We're just going to get started right on the dot because I have a lot of slides. I started the week with about 50 slides, which is way too many for a 30-minute talk. And then every time I went into my deck to actually edit them, they ended up being longer than it was the time before. So I just eventually had to walk away from my deck. So this is going to feel a little bit more like maybe an Ignite talk than a regular talk. But I've got a lot of material to get through. So a little bit about me. This is where you can find me on Twitter if you have questions afterwards. I blog at the Performance Beacon, and I also, which is a blog about performance, analytics, optimization, things like that. And I also co-curate WPO stats with Tim Cadlick, and it's a repository of case studies around the impact of performance on user experience metrics, business metrics, things like that. So kind of a go-to place for people who want to make a case for investing in performance. And my title, I have one of those weird tech titles. I'm officially senior researcher and evangelist at SOSTA. So what SOSTA does is we're in the digital performance management space, which means we have solutions for performance testing, load testing, real user monitoring, that sort of thing. What I do there that's really fun is I'm kind of the ultimate beta tester for our own tools. So I don't do sales or anything like that. I just, because we monitor the performance of almost 50 of the top 100 retailers, along with a lot of other sites, I have access to just a ton, like a cajillion pieces. That's actually a data science term, by the way, cajillion. A cajillion pieces of user data from all of these different retailers. And so I am in the very lucky position of, if you care about user experience, which I do, and you are really, really nosy, which I am, you can dig into all this anonymized data and ask it some really interesting questions about how people use the web. I have written this book for O'Reilly. It's going to be out this spring. If you're interested in this kind of thing. Oh, I also have some preview editions of the sample chapter. If you're interested, you can come up afterwards and grab them. So this is what we're going to be covering, and it seems like 4 really simple questions, but actually, there's an entire conference, a Velocity conference, which basically is about answering these 4 questions. So I'm going to be trying to squish an entire Velocity conference into one 30-minute talk. The first half, just looking at user experience and business metrics and some really interesting case studies that show the impact of performance on those kinds of metrics. And then, even though I'm not a developer, I'm a data person and a researcher, because I've looked at so much data and I have analyzed just thousands and thousands of film strips of how pages render, I've learned a lot about what are the most common performance issues. And then because I know a lot of people in the performance space, a lot of really smart people who fix these problems, I'm kind of like a performance librarian. I can sort of say, go to this resource, go to that resource, depending on the problem you're trying to fix. So that's what I will be attempting to do in our 30 minutes. So let's start with the first question. What do users want? And I like this guy. This is, he's the most abused person in user experience and user design, is the straw man, because if you've ever sat in on any design meetings, there's a lot of talk about, well, I think users would want this, and I think actually, like, our users would like us to create something like that. And the straw man gets badly abused in our space. And I was a user experience person a long time ago before I got involved in performance. And what got me into the usability testing side of things was that I got tired of kicking around a straw man. I like to actually look at real data, real people, what they actually do in lab test settings and real world settings. So that's interesting to me. Having said that, there's a place for surveys, kind of anecdotal research in what people, in terms of what people say they want to do online and what their expectations are of the sites that they visit. So at SOSTA last year, we commissioned Harris Interactive to do a poll of a couple thousand internet users between the ages of 20 and 45, and we asked them, what are your top frustrations? And the thing that was not surprising was that the number one thing that people are concerned about is online security. No surprise there. But second and third are issues around performance and availability. About almost a third of people are troubled by slow load times, and about a quarter of them are really bothered by sites just being unavailable or pages crashing during transactions. There's an Akamai survey as well that goes back to 2009, but these numbers are more or less hold true, that about half of consumers expect pages to load in 2 seconds or less. And so that's something that when people ask me, you know, what's the ideal load time? How fast is fast enough? I point to this as being kind of a goal, but then with the huge caveat that how fast is fast enough really depends on your site, your users, things like that. And then some more research from Akamai. When sites don't perform as users expect, about half of them will go to a competitor's site next, or they say they will. About a third of them say they will never return to the site, and about 1 out of 5 of them say that they will complain about the site to their friends on social media, in real life, that sort of thing. So next slide is probably, when I talk about all of these things, probably this is the most common response that I get from people who own websites or manage websites. If you've ever heard yourself saying this, but my site is different. Well, you know, of course, every site is different. But in terms of how your site is affected by performance issues, I would argue that your site is probably more like other sites than unlike, in the sense that every site, if you look at enough data around, or enough user experience data around how people actually use your site and if they completed transactions, if they bounce, things like that, and you're looking at the right metric for your business, I have yet to find a metric that wasn't affected by performance gains or losses. So just as a for instance, this is based on looking at a lot of data at SOSTA, where the top line is the conversion rate decrease as a site gets slower for a general merchandiser, and the bottom blue line is conversion rate decrease as site got slower for a specialty goods retailer. And so conversion rate for the uninitiated is just the percentage of people who come to your site and convert, who become paying customers, they complete a transaction. And so what's interesting here is, obviously because a specialty site is has more competitors in the space, people are more likely to kind of freak out and leave after 3 or 4 seconds. But what's notable is that even though, relatively speaking, the specialty goods retailer didn't suffer as much, there's still a steady decline. So even if you are, you only have 3 competitors in your space, you're still going to feel some impact of performance change, probably. So a quick flyover tour of some case studies in this space. On the retail side, you may already be familiar with some of these. Walmart, Staples, Intuit all found that when they looked at all of the user data, when they moved the needle in terms of median load time for their users, that they saw improvements in conversion rate. Even shaving 1 second, as Staples did from their median load time, improved conversions by 10%. So it's interesting stuff there. And this holds for mobile as well. Last summer, I took a dive into the performance on mobile for one of our big retail customers. And what was really interesting was that the conversion rate peaked at about 1.9%, which is pretty good for mobile. Like generally conversions for retail are anywhere between 2% and 6%. 4% is kind of the average. But 2% for mobile is pretty good. And the sweet spot for that, I don't know if you can make out the numbers on the histogram, was around 2.4 second load times for mobile. So the reason why I did this kind of dive was to put to rest, or at least begin to put to rest, some questions that people have, or some common objections that people have around mobile performance, which are that mobile users are more patient, or people are more patient when they're on mobile than they are when they're on their desktop. Not true. People don't convert it even as much on mobile as they do on desktop. Again, not true. We see conversion rates are really high for mobile. And the other interesting thing was just how quickly that dip occurs in terms of conversion rate plummeting for mobile shoppers. And actually, I think that I cut it out because I had too many slides. But there's another set of graphs that shows that if you actually took the same site and grabbed user data for the same period of time and looked at the desktop user behavior. Actually, people were more patient on desktop because that spike, or that drop, actually happens a little bit later and it's much, much more gradual. So it seems like on mobile, people actually are more inclined to give up earlier than later. Performance also affects metrics like time on site, traffic, bounce rate, page views, as these case studies all attest. And I really like this one. This is the folks at Etsy did a little experiment. They're always doing little experiments like this, where they just added 160 kilobytes of invisible junk to the pages that were served through mobile users to see what impact that would have on metrics. And as Lara Hogan, the senior engineering manager who focuses on their mobile side, found that it actually triggered a 12% increase in bounce rate, which is really, really huge. And so if you think about 160 kilobytes on a page that's typically like under 1 meg, you're looking at like a page that's 20% fatter than it would have been otherwise, triggering that much of a change. And we also find that performance really affects even just brand perception and perception of other aspects of the page. So this was a study that we did back when I was working for another company called Radware, where we got people into a usability test lab, and we actually put EEG devices on their heads, and we gave them some transactions to do, and then we didn't tell them. We artificially slowed down the pages for some cohorts of our test subjects and not for others. They didn't know we were doing this. They thought it was just a standard usability test. And what was interesting was that when we did exit interviews with all the people who participated in the study, the people who received the slower pages gave us a lot more negative words around their experience. They gave us a lot more words in general. They actually had more to say. Those exit interviews were longer. And they, not only did they say more negative things, but the negative things they said were about things that didn't necessarily have anything to do with performance. So you see slow up there in, in really large letters. But you also saw confusing. You saw ugly. You saw frustrating, hard to navigate. So basically, people were critiquing the usability of the site, the architecture of the site, like the information architecture of the site, I should be specific, the design and the content. All of those things got kind of negatively painted with whatever the opposite of a halo effect is of performance. That was it. And another interesting Akamai study was that people will abandon a site, permanently abandon a site if it experiences an outage. They won't go back. But actually 28% of people that abandon a site due to slowdowns won't return. So you can see abandonment rate being much more negatively affected. The interesting thing is that outages get big headlines, and people get woken up at 2 a.m. to deal with an outage. Nobody gets woken up by an urgent call at 2 a.m. to deal with the fact that their site is 1 or 2 seconds slower than it should be. So let's get into, I've sort of talked about the case study side of things. So now let's talk about what are the most common performance and UX issues that I see. So in the course of the last 7 or 8 years that I've been working in this space, I've looked at a lot of waterfall charts. I've looked at a lot of film strip views of pages available via different tools. And this might not be a surprise to you, but this is what a lot of pages look like. If you, I kind of compress the film strip view, so you're just seeing it in half-second increments, but basically blank, then maybe some nav elements, maybe not, and then the entire page just like rushes to populate. And time to interact, when I've looked at time to interact for a lot of retail sites using synthetic tools, we're generally looking at like 4 to 5 seconds, which is not great. Why does it matter? Well, there's an interesting eye tracking study that was done by Nielsen Norman Group a few years ago, where they used eye tracking software and served people 2 versions of the same page. This is the version of the page that loaded instantaneously. You saw people's eyes move around to that primary content up at the top. That hero image, which you're assuming, if you put a hero image there, you want people to see it, or else why do you even have a hero image? But that's under ideal circumstances. After you introduce an 8-second delay, this is where people's eyes travel. They move down to the bottom of the page. They might kind of glance up at the top, but they've given up, essentially. So if you are not serving your primary content as quickly as possible, ideally in that under 4-second or under 2-second threshold, then this is what people could be experiencing whenever they visit your page. So what's causing this? Well, basically all of these problems. Again, you're not going to be surprised, style sheets like CSS, JavaScript, third parties, images, the usual suspects. The bottom two are the ones I really want to talk about on this slide, which are the fact that a lot of us really do our design, our development, and our testing process in an ivory tower. We're not out testing out in the real world. We're not designing in the real world. When we do, if you even do usability tests in a lab, you're not actually simulating how the page might really render for people. So you're testing in this like totally ivory tower situation. And then doing very little to no real user monitoring of live sites, and which is where you actually see how your performance issues affect real users out in the wild. So let's get through 19 things you can do. There are actually way more than 19 things you can do. People have written huge books about all the things you can do, but I'm just going to, this is the part where the performance librarian part of me is going to take over, and I'm just going to start being like, just directing you to a lot of different resources. There's that phrase, I stand on the shoulder of giants. That's me. This is from the movie Iron Giant. I don't know if everybody's seen the Iron Giant. It's a great movie. You'll cry. But I'm Hubie right there on the shoulder of the Iron Giant, waving and saying, here, there are a lot of great people that, who have provided over the past 10 years amazing resources for fixing these problems. And so I'm going to direct you to as many of them as I can. So of course we have Steve Souders, who wrote the book High Performance Websites back in 2006, I believe. It's kind of the Bible of the performance space. You've probably heard of it. Maybe you've read it. You might have it sitting on your desk. Definitely, it's a good place to start. It's some of it, it might be a little bit out of date because of things like HTTP2 coming along, which kind of preclude some of the techniques that he suggests. But really, the big thing is his message is that 80 to 90% of user response time is at the front end, so start there. So these are primarily front-end solutions I'm going to be putting your way. So the number one problem with the web today, with pages today on the web, as again you probably know, our pages are very large and very complex. This was, I don't even know, can you see the little, this is the 1995 page here that was 14.1 kilobytes in size. And this is our 2016 page, according to the HTTP archive, is over 2 megs in size. I calculated, so you don't have to, that's actually an increase of 16,000%. So I don't know how many people here think that the web has actually gotten 16,000% faster over the past 20 years. I'm not quite sure it has. So you can see where, whatever we're doing with our networks to make them faster on one end, we're doing stuff to our pages on the other end to mitigate whatever improvements we're getting. And we're seeing the same on mobile. This just goes back 5 years, but we're looking at pages today that are almost 4 times larger than they were just 5 years ago, being served to mobile devices. And another common objection that I hear is, but networks are getting faster, so who cares? Not a big deal. Well, Mike Belshie did a great study in 2010 where he actually showed the benefit of adding extra megabytes per second, and it's not as stunning as you think it is. I actually had an argument with my husband, who doesn't work in tech at all, who just flat out didn't believe me when I told him that our recent exciting upgrade, I live in a very tiny mountain town, we went from 5 megabytes per second to 60 megabytes per second. So he's like, oh my God, we're gonna be so much faster. And I was like, well, we'll be somewhat faster, more reliable maybe. We can finally watch Netflix videos all the way to the end. And I revisited Mike's study recently where, just again, testing, is bandwidth a magic bullet for web performance. And I don't know if you can make out the numbers there, but the light blue bar at the far end is 20 megabyte per second download times, and the slightly darker bar is 5 megabyte per second download times. And if you see the load time improvements on the other side, the difference between 5 megabytes per second and 20 megabytes per second, according to synthetic tests, is about 0.8 second improvement. So it's nice, it's good, but it's not gonna rock anybody's world. So things you can do. Know where your page weight is coming from, and I'm going to get into these a little bit deeper in a second. Create a performance budget for your pages and constantly measure what your pages are doing. I'm going to demonstrate with Etsy because they're a really good site, and I know I can demo things on their site without embarrassing them because performance-wise, they're kind of one-percenters. So this is the Etsy homepage. There's a really great tool called PerfMap, which it's a Chrome extension. You can get it at the Chrome store. And what it does is it's just a little plugin, and it created by Mark Zaman from SpeedCurve, and it overlays this heat map on your page that actually shows you the render times and the sizes of the different visual assets on the page. Super, super handy, especially if you work with non-technical people who you could show them a waterfall and they just go, ugh. This is a really great way of getting the message across that not optimizing your assets is a problem. So again, there's where you can find it. In terms of setting a performance budget for your pages, the next step is, certainly page size is not the only problem, and you can have really bulky pages that are still highly performant from a user experience perspective, maybe not from a bandwidth perspective, but a lot of pages would benefit from being trimmed down if at all possible, even just optimizing your images, which I'll get to in a second. But so setting a performance budget for your page in terms of total size, total number of files. Tim Cadillac has written a couple of awesome posts on how to do that, which would merit their very own talk. But I recommend you checking those out. And again, an example from Akamai is how they've actually built in live monitoring and feedback actually in a toolbar to internal folks. So you can actually see the data for each page, how big the page is and how long it takes to render right across the top. So and letting pages know if they're in or out of whatever service level agreement you've come up with for your performance budget. So moving on to images. 63% of the average web page is comprised of images. Most of these images are not optimized, as you can see from this little waterfall snippet. This is a mega huge image. It's about 6 megs, which is probably bigger than you want it to be. When the problem with images is you have so many people touching a page. You know this as developers and designers, and sometimes you can't control what those people do. But a lot of the images that I see are, I've seen pages that were brutally slowed down because somebody thought it was a good idea to have the image be an animated GIF. Instead, it was a huge hero image, animated GIF, and they wondered why their site was slow. People just don't know. And it's not a willful ignorance thing. It's just everybody, in most organizations works in their little silos, and performance isn't on people's radar. So creating awareness amongst everybody who touches a page about reformatting, using image compression on the developer side, deferring or lazy loading your images, using adaptive images, using advanced techniques like auto preloading. Guy Pajarni, who also speaks today, he's here. This is a little shout out to a great free webcast that he did for O'Reilly on how to make high performance images. So let's move on to page complexity. So again, going back into the Wayback Machine, 1995, average page had actually just under 3 assets, which like HTML, an image, maybe another image. That was it. Those were great days. It was that was when I got online, and it was like white background, Helvetica, or no, not Helvetica. It would have been Times Roman, and then images were introduced. It was very exciting. And then today we have the average page has about 100 resources or more. I see pages with 200, 300, 400 resources. And all those resources introduce a ton of complexity, as I'm sure many of you are aware. If you're not already using web page test, maybe you're using something else that's synthetic monitoring for you, I highly recommend running it and training people. I teach people who are not technical people how to use web page test, how to generate waterfalls and interpret waterfalls from a less technical perspective, how to read a film strip, how to generate videos, all of these things. So this is just a snippet from a site where, for the Weight Watchers site, for example, and just showing all the CSS, all of the images, all these bits and pieces. And this is just one snippet out of about 200 assets on the page, but just showing all the things that were blocking the page from rendering. Web fonts, another big problem potentially. I mean, I love the idea of having custom fonts. It's obviously a huge boon for designers, being able to control your brand online. You can have custom fonts without killing performance, but a lot of sites have custom fonts that do kill performance. So for example, this was hosted externally and it was blocking the page. So not only did the font never actually render, it blocked the rest of the page from rendering as well before it finally gave up. And pop-ups, using pop-ups. I mean, pretty much you can't go to a retail site now without getting 2 or 3 pop-ups. It's kind of shocking how many of them aren't optimized. So not only are they from a usability perspective, sort of blocking the page, which some people find annoying, but the fact is it works, so I can see why marketers choose to use them. But the worst is when the pop-up, not only the pop-up doesn't render, but it blocks the rest of the page from rendering, or the pop-up does render and it blocks the rest of the page from rendering. So you actually have to kill the pop-up and then the rest of the page renders behind it. So just some gotchas there with regard to pop-ups. So things you can do, obviously consolidation is a really obvious one going way back. Putting your style sheets in the document head, optimizing your fonts, and Ilya Grigorik from Google wrote an awesome post about that. Optimizing your pop-up scripts, and again, getting back to this idea that you need to monitor your site in the wild all the time. Also recommend this talk, which is from Nick Zakis. It was an awesome talk. And again, I'm not a developer. I don't know a ton about JavaScript, but but I know enough to know that it's there's ways to use it intelligently. And as Nick pointed out in his talk, the problem with JavaScript is that it sort of seems to incur this pioneering spirit in people, so that it's like, well, what else can we do in JavaScript? So a whole bunch of things that you can build using HTML or CSS or other tools just get built in JavaScript just because you can. And even though he is a huge JavaScript advocate, he even proposes that maybe we don't have to make all of the things in JS. And that sort of necessarily leads to third-party scripts. And this is where things can get out of your control as a developer, as a designer. I've seen pages where third-party content made up more than 50% of all the requests on the page. Problem with that is, obviously there's a latency hit. There's a problem if your third-party scripts are not asynchronous, or if they're delaying the content on the rest of the page. There are issues with if the files are really large. There are issues where you have third-party scripts that actually make fourth-party calls or fifth-party calls. I've seen actually waterfalls that showed 20 calls made by one third-party script. And so there are security issues where you go from HTTPS script to along the road HTTP scripts, and that opens up holes. And just this, it's a bit of a massive loss of visibility. There's a great tool that you can use, created by Pat Meenan from who designed Web Page Test, called Spoffomatic, that artificially black holes third-party scripts. You just choose the script you want to black hole, and it shows you what would happen to your page if the third party failed. In some cases, it looks the same, top and bottom. But with so obviously that's an indicator that that third party isn't a risk to you. But in other cases, this is a real example, an actual page where a third-party script going down resulted in taking the page more than 22 seconds to render. So definitely recommend checking out these tools. My browser is just basically filled with plugins, so just lots of plugins, which whole other performance issue there, but I won't go into that. So things you can do: defer your scripts, use async versions, understand your scripts and what their performance penalties are. Do A/B tests with your scripts. If the script is promising you some kind of conversion gain, then do an A/B test with it and see, does it actually deliver that performance gain or that conversion gain? Or does it incur enough of a performance loss that performance loss hurts your conversion gain? So I highly recommend A/B testing scripts, and again, monitoring them constantly. And fortunately, there are tools that have built up around this. And keep on learning. So how many people here have been to the Velocity conference before? Okay, so quite a few. It's a great conference. If you care about this and you really want to dive into the topic, I highly recommend going to one of the Velocity conferences where you will just live and breathe this for 3 days. All the people that I've referenced here and many, many more speak at Velocity, and they're super knowledgeable. This book, written by Lara Hogan, Designing for Performance, is a must-read. Another book by Barbara Burma's, Lean Websites, another great read. You can download mine if you want as well. And as I said, I do have some copies up here if you feel like grabbing one. And if you're interested in any of this and want to click on any of the links that were in this talk, or you want more, this is like such an abridged version of this talk that I do. It's kind of absurd. So if you have questions about any of this or want to go into more depth with anything, you can find me in any of these places or out in the hallway, and I'm done. Thank you.